What happens when a Hollywood legend walks into a live television studio expecting a routine morning interview, and suddenly finds himself pushed into a confrontation he never saw coming? The cameras were already rolling. Bright studio lights poured across the Good Morning America set, reflecting off the polished floor and the glass panels behind the hosts. Outside, New York was beginning another hectic morning, but inside Studio One, everything felt strangely controlled. Producers whispered through headsets. Camera operators adjusted their positions. A few members of the audience shifted nervously in their seats, waiting for the next segment. And then Sylvester Stallone walked onto the set. At first, there was applause. Not the polite kind. It was loud, immediate, almost nostalgic. The kind of applause reserved for someone whose face had been part of American cinema for decades. Stallone gave a small nod, his expression calm but serious. He wore a dark jacket over a simple shirt, his posture slightly rigid as he approached the interview chairs. He acknowledged the audience with a brief wave before taking his seat. Across from him sat Michael Strahan. Strahan smiled. The cameras tightened their focus. For several seconds, everything looked completely normal. Two recognizable television personalities sitting beneath the familiar morning show lights. A Hollywood icon. A veteran broadcaster. A conversation that was supposed to promote a new project, discuss Stallone's career, and perhaps revisit some of the iconic characters that had made his name legendary. But there was something different in the room. Something difficult to explain. Stallone noticed it. The slight pause between questions. The producer standing behind the camera. The way Strahan glanced briefly toward his notes before looking back at him. Stallone leaned back. His fingers slowly came together. He waited. Strahan began with an easy question. Sylvester, after all these years, what keeps you coming back? Stallone smiled faintly. I think, he said slowly, you keep coming back because you haven't finished what you started. The audience responded with warm laughter. Strahan nodded. That's a good answer. For a moment, the tension disappeared. Stallone relaxed slightly. But then Strahan changed direction. The next question wasn't about movies. It wasn't about acting. And it certainly wasn't what Stallone appeared to be expecting. Strahan looked down at his notes. Then back up. There has been a lot of discussion lately about your career choices, your public image, and some of the decisions you've made over the years. Stallone's expression changed. Only slightly. Most viewers might never have noticed. His smile disappeared. His eyes narrowed for just a fraction of a second. He didn't interrupt. He simply waited. Strahan continued. Do you ever look back and think that some of the things you've done were driven more by pride than by principle? The studio became quieter. Stallone blinked. One time. Slowly. His jaw tightened. The audience could feel the shift. Even the people who didn't know what was coming could sense that the conversation had crossed an invisible line. Stallone leaned forward. That's an interesting way to put it. His voice was calm. Too calm. Strahan didn't back away. I'm asking whether you think fame can sometimes make people believe they're above criticism. A camera moved closer. Stallone's face filled the monitor. His expression was almost motionless, but his eyes were suddenly intense. For a few seconds, he said nothing. Then he gave a short breath through his nose. You know, Stallone said, I've been criticized for a long time. Strahan nodded. I understand. No, Stallone replied. The single word landed differently. The audience stopped laughing. Stallone's hands separated. He placed both palms against his knees. You don't understand. There was no shouting yet. No explosion. Just a change in temperature. The studio suddenly felt smaller. Strahan remained composed. Then help us understand. Stallone stared at him. The veteran actor had spent decades playing men who absorbed punches, stood back up, and kept moving forward. But now the character everyone knew from the screen seemed to disappear, leaving behind a man who looked genuinely tired of explaining himself. "You want to talk about pride?" Stallone asked. Strahan nodded. "Yes." Stallone leaned closer. "Then let's talk about the price of having it." Silence. The audience watched. Nobody moved. Behind the cameras, a producer lifted a hand toward his headset. Something was happening that wasn't in the original rhythm of the interview. Strahan glanced at his notes again. "There are people who believe you've been protected by your reputation." Stallone's eyebrows lifted. "Protected?" "Yes." "By who?" "By Hollywood. By the public. By the fact that you've become an icon." Stallone slowly shook his head. An almost invisible smile appeared on his face. But it wasn't amusement. It was disbelief. "You think being an icon protects you?" Strahan paused. Stallone continued. "You think people don't come after you because you're famous?" His voice became lower. "They come after you because you're famous." The audience remained silent. Strahan looked directly at him. "And yet you've benefited enormously from that fame." "Of course I have." The answer came immediately. No hesitation. "I worked for it." Strahan leaned forward. "Nobody is questioning the work." Stallone's eyes sharpened. "Then what are you questioning?" That was the moment the entire atmosphere changed. The cameras were still recording. The lights were still blazing. The morning show graphics were still running. But the conversation no longer felt like television. It felt personal. Strahan took a breath. "I'm questioning whether success sometimes changes the way you respond when someone challenges you." Stallone stared at him. 5 seconds. 6. 7. Then he slowly turned his head toward the audience. A few people looked away. He turned back. "You want to challenge me?" Strahan answered carefully. "I'm asking questions." "No." Stallone's voice hardened. "You're doing more than that." The audience reacted with a quiet murmur. One of the cameras shifted position. The red recording light remained on. Stallone noticed it. For a moment, he seemed to realize exactly what was happening. Millions of viewers could be watching. Every word could be replayed. Every expression could become a headline. He could have stopped. He could have smiled. He could have made a joke. Instead, he leaned forward again. "Let me tell you something." Strahan waited. Stallone's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "You don't know what it took to get here." The words hung in the studio. For the first time, Strahan's expression softened. But the tension didn't disappear. If anything, it became heavier. Because now the interview wasn't about a movie. It wasn't even about fame. It was about something underneath all of it. Years of rejection. Years of being underestimated. Years of being told that he didn't belong. And years of fighting to prove otherwise. Stallone looked down briefly. His fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. Then he looked back at Strahan. "And I'm not going to sit here and let somebody reduce all of that to an attitude problem." The audience reacted. A few people applauded. Others remained completely still. Strahan waited until the applause faded. Then he asked the question that would change the entire interview. "If you're so comfortable with your choices, why does this bother you so much?" Stallone froze. The studio went silent. Even the audience seemed to stop breathing. His eyes remained fixed on Strahan. For several seconds, there was no response. Then Stallone slowly leaned back. His face became unreadable. A producer behind the camera suddenly looked toward another producer. Something had clearly gone wrong. Or perhaps something had gone exactly as someone intended. Stallone looked toward the main camera. Then back at Strahan. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. Because you just asked me the wrong question. Strahan's eyebrows lifted. What should I have asked? Stallone paused. A long pause. Then he leaned toward the microphone. You should have asked me what really happened. The audience shifted. Strahan stopped smiling. The camera moved in closer. And for the first time that morning, Michael Strahan looked genuinely uncertain about where this conversation was heading. Stallone's expression hardened. There are things you don't know. The studio lights seemed suddenly brighter. The room felt warmer. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. And then Stallone said something that made the producers behind the cameras exchange nervous looks. Because if we're going to tell the truth this morning. He stopped. His eyes locked onto Strahan. Then we might as well tell all of it. The camera stayed on his face. The screen cut to a close-up. And somewhere behind the studio wall, a producer quietly said into his headset, "Stay with him." The interview had just entered a completely different territory. And whatever Stallone was about to reveal could change everything. The studio seemed to hold its breath. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The cameras remained locked on Sylvester Stallone, capturing every small movement, the tightening of his jaw, the slight rise and fall of his shoulders, the way his eyes moved from Michael Strahan to the audience and then back again. Behind the main camera, producers were communicating rapidly through their headsets. But Stallone appeared almost completely unaware of them now. Or perhaps he simply didn't care. He had reached a point where the polished boundaries of a morning television interview no longer seemed important. Michael Strahan slowly lowered his notes. Then tell us, he said. Stallone looked at him. Tell you what? What really happened? A long silence followed. Stallone's expression hardened. You want the real story? Strahan nodded. Yes. Stallone leaned forward. Then don't interrupt me. The audience became completely still. Strahan gave a small nod. Okay. Stallone took a slow breath. For years, people have watched the success. They see the movies. They see the money. They see the awards, the premieres, the interviews. They see the photographs and assume that was the story. He paused. But they don't see everything that happened before the success. His voice wasn't loud. That almost made it more powerful. He spoke with the measured tone of someone opening a door he had kept closed for a very long time. I know what it's like to be told no. The audience listened. I know what it's like to walk into a room and have people look at you like you don't belong there. Strahan's expression softened. Stallone continued. And I know what it's like to have somebody decide what you're capable of before you've even opened your mouth. The camera moved closer. Stallone's eyes briefly dropped toward the floor. For just a second, the anger disappeared. What remained was something more vulnerable. Then Strahan asked quietly, and you think that's what people are doing now? Stallone looked up. I think people forget. Forget what? That there is a human being underneath the image. The audience responded with a few quiet murmurs. Strahan nodded slowly. But isn't criticism part of being successful? Stallone smiled faintly. Absolutely. Then why react so strongly? Stallone's smile vanished. Because criticism and disrespect aren't the same thing. The sentence landed heavily. Strahan sat back. Stallone continued. You can question my decisions. You can disagree with me. You can tell me you think I made a mistake. That's fine. He pointed lightly toward the table between them. But don't pretend you know my entire life because you've read 3 paragraphs about me. The audience applauded. Stallone waited. Then Strahan asked, "Do you feel that's happened to you?" Stallone didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved toward the audience. "I know it has." The room became quiet again. Strahan looked down at his notes. Then he asked another question. "Some people might say you're using your past to avoid answering the criticism." Stallone's head turned sharply. There it was. The spark. His eyebrows lifted. "Are you serious?" Strahan remained calm. "I'm giving you the opportunity to respond." Stallone laughed once. A short, humorless laugh. "No. You're giving me the opportunity to defend myself. Isn't that what an interview is?" "No." Stallone leaned forward. "An interview is a conversation." He pointed toward Strahan. "This feels like a trial." The audience reacted immediately. Some gasped. Others applauded. Strahan's expression tightened. "I don't think anyone is putting you on trial." Stallone stared at him. "Then why does it feel like I'm being cross-examined?" A producer behind the cameras whispered urgently into his headset. The host beside the main desk looked toward the control room. The atmosphere had become so tense that even the normal background movement of the studio seemed to disappear. Then Strahan asked a question that changed the mood again. "Do you regret anything?" Stallone stopped. This time, the question seemed to reach somewhere deeper. He looked down. His hands rested motionless on his knees. "Of course." The answer was quiet. "Everybody does." "What do you regret most?" Stallone looked toward the floor. The bright studio lights reflected in his eyes. "Things I couldn't fix." Strahan waited. Stallone continued. "People I couldn't help. Moments I couldn't go back to. Things I said when I should have stayed quiet." His voice became slower. "And things I didn't say when I should have spoken." The audience remained silent. For a brief moment, the confrontation seemed to disappear. Two men were simply sitting across from each other. One asking difficult questions. The other remembering decades of his life. But then Strahan said, "So maybe that's what people are reacting to. Maybe they see a man who doesn't like being challenged." Stallone's eyes immediately returned to him. The vulnerability disappeared. "You keep going back to that. Because it's important." "No." Stallone shook his head. "It's convenient." Strahan frowned. "Convenient?" "Yes." Stallone's voice became sharper. "Because if you make this about my temper, you don't have to talk about what I actually said." Strahan leaned forward. "Then what are you actually saying?" Stallone looked directly into his eyes. "I'm saying you don't get to manufacture a version of me and then ask me to defend it." A murmur moved through the audience. Strahan remained silent. Stallone continued. "That's the problem." The room went quiet. People create a character. Then they get angry when the real person doesn't behave like the character they invented. The camera captured Strahan's reaction. His lips pressed together. His eyebrows lowered slightly. For the first time, he looked less like a television host and more like someone personally challenged. He took a breath. "Sylvester, nobody is manufacturing anything." Stallone responded immediately. "Then ask me something real." Strahan looked at his notes. He flipped one page. Then another. And finally, he closed the folder. The gesture was small. But everyone noticed. "I'm going to ask you something real." Stallone nodded. Strahan looked directly at him. "Do you believe your reputation has ever made you unwilling to hear someone else's perspective?" Stallone stared at him. The question was different. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a headline. It was personal. For several seconds, Stallone didn't respond. Then he leaned back. Yes. The answer surprised everyone. Strahan blinked. Stallone continued. I probably have. The tension lowered slightly. I've made mistakes. He looked toward the audience. I've been stubborn. A few people smiled. I've been angry when I shouldn't have been. Then he looked back at Strahan. But there's a difference between admitting your flaws and allowing someone else to define you by them. Strahan nodded. That's fair. Stallone seemed to relax. But then Strahan asked one final question. And if someone watching this interview says you're proving their point right now? Stallone's expression changed. He stared at Strahan. Then slowly smiled. Maybe they are. The audience laughed nervously. Stallone continued. But at least they're watching the real conversation. Strahan smiled slightly. For a moment, the tension seemed to break. But then a producer suddenly walked toward the edge of the set. He wasn't supposed to enter the frame. He stopped. Touched his headset. And looked toward the control room. Stallone noticed. His eyes followed the producer. Then he looked back at Strahan. What's going on? Strahan looked confused. I don't know. The producer said something quietly into his microphone. Stallone's face tightened. Are we going to commercial? The producer nodded. Strahan turned toward the camera. We're going to take a quick break. But Stallone didn't move. He looked at Strahan. Before we do. Strahan paused. Stallone leaned toward him. There is one thing you haven't asked me. Strahan waited. What? Stallone looked directly into the camera. And his expression suddenly became serious. You haven't asked me why I almost walked away from everything. The audience gasped. Strahan's eyes widened slightly. What do you mean? Stallone sat back. I mean exactly what I said. The music began. The control room prepared the commercial transition. But Strahan wasn't looking at the camera anymore. He was looking at Stallone. Why? Stallone looked at him. Then the screen abruptly transitioned toward the commercial break. But the question remained hanging in the air. Why had Sylvester Stallone once considered walking away from the world that made him famous? And more importantly, what had happened that morning to bring those old wounds back to the surface? Because when the cameras returned, Stallone would no longer be talking about fame. He would be talking about something much more personal. Something that neither Strahan nor the audience appeared prepared to hear. When the cameras came back, the atmosphere had changed. The applause track was gone. The music had faded. The bright energy of the morning show had been replaced by an almost uncomfortable silence. Michael Strahan sat quietly across from Sylvester Stallone. Neither man was smiling. The audience waited. Stallone looked down for several seconds before finally raising his eyes. Strahan spoke first. Before the break, you said there was a time when you almost walked away from everything. Stallone nodded. Yes. Why? Stallone took a long breath. Because there comes a point in every person's life when they start asking themselves whether the thing they're fighting for is still worth the fight. Nobody moved. Stallone continued. For me, success didn't arrive the way people imagine. He looked toward the audience. It wasn't one magical moment where everything suddenly changed. He paused. It was years of being told no. His voice became softer. Years of wondering whether I was wasting my life. Strahan listened. Stallone's fingers slowly moved across the armrest. I remember sitting alone after meetings, driving home, thinking, maybe they're right. The studio remained silent. Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I'm not meant for this. Maybe I should stop. He looked toward Strahan. But then I'd wake up the next morning and try again. Strahan nodded slowly. And that's why the criticism bothers you? Stallone considered the question. No. He shook his head. What bothers me is when people look at the final chapter and pretend they understand the entire book. The audience applauded. This time Stallone didn't look angry. He looked relieved. Strahan leaned forward. Then maybe that's what today's conversation has really been about. Stallone looked at him. Maybe. Strahan paused. I pushed you. You did. Maybe harder than you expected. Definitely. A small laugh moved through the audience. For the first time since the confrontation began, both men smiled. But the moment didn't completely erase what had happened. Strahan looked serious again. Was I disrespectful? Stallone didn't answer immediately. The question seemed to matter. Finally, he said, at times. The audience became quiet again. Strahan nodded. I appreciate you saying that. Stallone looked at him. And I could have handled some of my reactions better. Strahan smiled. That's fair. Stallone leaned back. I get angry. The audience laughed softly. You've noticed. Strahan laughed. Just a little. Stallone smiled. But anger isn't always the enemy. He paused. Sometimes anger is just hurt wearing armor. The room fell silent. The sentence changed everything. The audience wasn't watching an argument anymore. They were watching two people reach the other side of one. Stallone looked toward the camera. And maybe that's what people forget. His voice became calm. You can be strong and still be hurt. He looked down. You can be successful and still doubt yourself. He raised his eyes. You can become famous and still wonder whether you're enough. The audience applauded. A few people stood. Stallone gave a small nod. For a moment, he looked almost overwhelmed by the reaction. He turned toward Strahan. And you can be angry without being your anger. Strahan nodded. That's probably something a lot of people can relate to. Stallone smiled. That's all I ever wanted people to understand. The camera slowly pulled back. The tension that had dominated the studio for most of the interview had finally dissolved. But then Strahan asked one final question. If you could speak to the younger version of yourself, the man who was sitting in those cars after those meetings, wondering whether he should quit, what would you tell him? Stallone looked down. His eyes became distant. For a few seconds, he seemed somewhere else entirely. Then he smiled. I'd tell him to keep going. Strahan waited. Even when nobody believes you. Especially then. The audience applauded. Stallone continued. But I'd also tell him something else. What? Don't become so obsessed with proving people wrong that you forget to become yourself. Strahan nodded. The word seemed to affect him. That's powerful. Stallone shrugged. Life teaches you eventually. The studio lights began to soften as the segment approached its end. The audience was still watching closely. Strahan turned toward Stallone. I think we started this conversation in a very different place. Stallone smiled. We certainly did. And I'm glad you stayed. Stallone looked at him. So am I. A brief silence. Then Strahan extended his hand. Stallone looked at it for a moment. The audience waited. Then he reached across the table. Their hands met. The handshake wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was simple. Human. The audience applauded loudly. Stallone nodded. Strahan smiled. But before they separated, Stallone leaned slightly closer and said something quietly enough that the microphones barely caught it. Next time, start with the coffee. Strahan laughed. The audience erupted. The tension finally broke. Stallone smiled. And for the first time that morning, the studio felt like a morning show again. The cameras pulled back. The bright lights reflected across the polished floor. The audience applauded as Strahan thanked Stallone for joining them. But the story didn't end with the handshake. Because outside the studio, the conversation would continue. Viewers would debate who was right. Some would say Strahan pushed too hard. Others would say Stallone overreacted. Some would focus on the confrontation. Others would focus on the unexpected vulnerability that came afterward. But perhaps the most important moment wasn't when Stallone raised his voice. It was when he admitted that even a man known around the world for strength had once wondered whether he was strong enough. Because behind every famous face is a story the cameras don't always capture. Behind every success is rejection. Behind every confident voice is uncertainty. And sometimes, behind anger, there is simply a person who has spent years trying to be understood. As the final camera angle widened, Stallone stood from his chair. He thanked the audience. Then he turned toward the exit. For a brief second, he stopped. He looked back at the set. At the cameras. At Strahan. And then he smiled. Not the Hollywood smile. Not the promotional smile. Just a small, genuine smile. The kind that suggested the argument had finally become something else. A conversation. A reminder. A moment neither man had planned. The studio lights began to fade. The audience applause slowly disappeared. And the final image was Stallone walking away from the set, shoulders relaxed, leaving behind the tension that had filled the room only minutes earlier. Maybe that was the real lesson. You don't always win by having the loudest voice. Sometimes you win by staying in the conversation long enough to be heard. And sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is admit that beneath the fame, beneath the success, beneath the tough exterior, there is still a human being. So what do you think? Was Stallone right to push back when the questions became personal, or did Strahan simply do what a journalist is supposed to do and ask the difficult questions? Let us know your opinion in the comments. If you enjoyed this dramatic story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves unforgettable Hollywood moments, and remember, sometimes the most explosive moments aren't planned. They're the moments when the cameras are rolling, the questions get uncomfortable, and someone finally decides to tell their side of the story. Thanks for watching.